In a world full of bizarre and unexpected situations, there are stories that make us shake our heads in disbelief while simultaneously unable to stop laughing. The first story, Routine Police Call Turns into Terrifying Disaster, takes place in a small town in Wisconsin where a call about a restraining order violation turned into an unusual standoff. In this case, Todd Harim made the police force witness a dangerous and unbelievable performance with an Axe body spray bottle becoming a threatening weapon. This story not only contains absurdity and humor but also delivers a lesson about respecting restraining orders and acting appropriately. The second story, entitled Lady Finally Gets What She Deserves, is a perfect example of excessive confidence and arrogant excuses. Bonnie, an ambitious woman with an unlicensed car, faced off with a police officer when she was driving without realizing that her driver's license had been suspended. Despite trying every excuse to get out of the situation, she ultimately had to face the consequences of her irresponsible actions and disregard for the law. The unexpected situations in both of these stories show that, while they may be humorous at times, carelessness and a disregard for rules can lead to unwanted outcomes. One routine police call turns into terrifying disaster. On a cold winter's day in December 2023 in Shaban Falls, Wisconsin, a woman called the police to report that her ex-boyfriend Todd Harim had violated a restraining order. Todd, with a wild mindset reminiscent of a B-movie villain, immediately planned to turn his home into a battlefield. Not only did he threaten to burn down the house, but he also decided to add a unique performance by inhaling the spray from an Axe body spray bottle, as if to send a message that this forest scent wasn't just fragrant, but. When the police arrived, they were immediately faced with the grand sight of Todd standing at the door, holding a gas can as if preparing for a BBQ, but perhaps the most dangerous BBQ in Shaban Falls history. With a determined look and a magnificent expression, Todd resembled a superhero stepping out of a B-action movie, one of those leads who is absurdly confident even when the situation calls for anyone normal to run away. The officers, standing outside, tried to remain calm, but they couldn't hide their skeptical expressions. They looked inside, wondering if the ex-girlfriend had managed to escape, or if she was still trapped in the mobile fireplace Todd had just lit in the middle of winter. Some even jokingly nudged their colleagues, saying, "Who would have thought our job would one day require us to join a candlelight party in the freezing cold?" Todd, undeterred, continued to hold his ground, as if he were standing before an audience eagerly awaiting his next performance. In true Hollywood self-directed style, Todd looked around with a serious expression, a look he surely believed could make the entire police force second-guess themselves. But for the officers, it was the kind of confidence that left them unsure whether to be annoyed or burst out laughing. Some even sighed and shook their heads. One muttered, "Does he think he's Rambo or something?" Everyone wondered if this would be the day they'd find themselves participating in the strangest candlelit party of their careers, or just another unexpected situation in the unpredictable nature of their work. Todd not only stood firm as the police approached, but he also immediately deployed a resistance tactic that was somewhat peculiar. Every time the officers took a step forward, Todd raised the gas can high, like a weapon of intimidation, inhaled deeply from the Axe spray bottle, and stared at them challengingly as though he were meditating during a special, steamy ritual of his own. Todd's gaze radiated the kind of determination he surely believed was empowering, but to the officers it was a bizarre mixture of amusing and concerning. The forest scent from the Axe body spray quickly enveloped the area, forming a pungent smoke cloud, so overpowering it was almost unbearable, but definitely the unique touch to this party. The officers tried to maintain their seriousness, but everyone couldn't help but feel the absurdity of the situation. One murmured, "Has anyone told him Axe isn't a tranquilizer?" Amid the thick smoke and overwhelming scent, all they could do was carefully step forward, hoping they wouldn't become the main course in Todd's unwanted BBQ that he was directing. Flames began to rise, smoke enveloped the house, and the police finally had no choice but to use fire extinguishers as part of their cooling-off operation for Todd. Each time Todd sprayed forest scent into the air, the officers performed a strategic retreat, as though this were a mock battle against an Axe body spray bottle. Meanwhile, Todd seemed to relish in his performance of the biggest smoke diffusion in Shaban Falls history, showing no intention of stepping outside. Ultimately, to rescue Todd from his self-directed show, the officers had no choice but to implement a rapid entry strategy. They broke through windows, smashed down the door, accompanied by helpless sighs, as if they were trying to uncork a wine bottle with a cork stuck for decades. No one wanted to damage someone else's property, but since this main character was so dangerously enthusiastic, every precaution had to make way for the mission to pull Todd out safely. Using every tool available, from pliers to crowbars, the officers proceeded like a professional rescue team, except their target wasn't a hostage, but the town's self-proclaimed action hero. When they finally pulled Todd outside, he looked like a baby bird that had fallen from its nest, utterly confused, eyes wide open in bewilderment. The smoke from the fire clung to his hair and clothes, making Todd resemble a character who had just walked out of an action blockbuster, though this movie was probably only streaming for free on social media. Todd, with a bewildered expression, as if questioning why the crowd outside was overreacting, sighed, took one final deep puff of smoke, and looked around as if to declare, "Is that it?" The police officers could only glance at each other, half relieved, half wanting to laugh at the absurdity of the situation. Todd had truly transformed into the lead role in the most bizarre film Shaban Falls had ever witnessed, and he would probably remain famous in this community for quite some time. The woman was fortunate to escape unharmed, and Todd was escorted outside in a state that couldn't have been worse for the cameras. Messy hair, clothes soaked in smoke, looking no different from a comedic character in movies about troublesome exes. Now he stood there, surrounded by the police, as though he had just fought a life-or-death battle with his very own Axe bottle. In the end, Todd faced a long list of charges, from arson and property damage to domestic violence. He probably never imagined that a small restraining order could serve as a one-way ticket to his criminal record collection. Sadly, he had made history in a way no one would want, as the first person accused of turning a body spray bottle into a weapon of mass destruction. The lesson here couldn't be clearer. Sometimes respecting a restraining order doesn't just help you avoid legal trouble, but also keeps a bit of dignity in your life. Because when you start fighting with a body spray bottle, the results won't smell sweet. It might even be as bitter as a cup of coffee without sugar, and the police and neighbors in Shaban Falls will probably think about it for a long time. Todd not only lost his chance to shine, but also lost his freedom and the little respect that the people of Shaban Falls may have once had for him. This story, with its unbelievable but true element, makes everyone laugh and shake their heads in disbelief, reminding us that life can be funny in ways we never expect. Certainly, turning an Axe spray bottle into a high-tech weapon was never a reasonable choice, especially when the goal wasn't to impress, but to cause panic, as Todd did. Stories like this are bizarre, but they also subtly emphasize a message about caution in situations where you're facing the police, a play Todd likely should have avoided if he had known the consequences. So if you really feel the need to spray the forest scent to stand out in front of someone, choose another occasion rather than using it in a smoky performance like Todd's. A restaurant, a park, or even the gym would be much more reasonable places. Because even in America, where sometimes it feels like anything crazy can happen, Spraying acts like this will hardly earn you favor, especially when your audience is a whole team of police, fire trucks, and a bunch of astonished neighbors watching. While one story revolves around the recklessness of a man who turns a tense situation into a crazy performance, the next story reveals another woman just as confident, but instead of facing danger in a bizarre way, she chooses to take on a confrontation with the authorities. Both thought they could handle everything easily, but in reality, their impulsive actions led to consequences they never expected. Story 2, entitled Lady Finally Gets What She Deserves. That day, Bonnie, an ambitious young mother with an unlicensed car, was leisurely driving home after a long day at work. Not only was she carrying a soon-to-be-born baby, but also a pile of financial troubles, as if life had intentionally piled everything onto her shoulders to make things challenging. Bonnie sneered, ignoring all the bad things, completely unaware that she was about to face a live interview with the authorities. "Hello, your license is suspended." That afternoon, Bonnie was driving home after a long day, humming her favorite song, her fingers lightly tapping along to the beat. The streets were quiet, serene as a lullaby, with only the last rays of sunlight lingering in the sky, creating a peaceful scene straight out of a movie. Bonnie smiled, feeling content with herself. She thought, "Today wasn't so bad. I've handled things pretty well." Suddenly, the flashing red and blue lights from behind broke the silence like a blinding signal, sending a message that wasn't particularly pleasant. Bonnie glanced at her rearview mirror, frowning. Must be someone else in trouble, she told herself, secretly believing that it had nothing to do with her. But when the siren blared louder and more insistently, signaling her to pull over, Bonnie reluctantly eased her car to the side, thinking to herself, just a routine check. Maybe I'll even get a compliment for driving safely." She stopped the car, still feeling relaxed, thinking the situation would soon pass. But as she saw the officer slowly approaching, Bonnie began to feel something a little odd. He didn't seem like he was doing a routine check at all. His eyes were sharp, his step steady, and his expression serious, showing no sign of friendliness. Bonnie looked closely through the rearview mirror and could sense the shift in the atmosphere. Suddenly, a feeling of unease crept into her chest, but she maintained her confident demeanor, even giving a small smile, thinking she could handle the situation. The officer stood at her car window without offering a friendly greeting. When he spoke, his voice was cold, even, and unyielding, like he was reading a charge sheet. "Hello, your license has been suspended." Bonnie's confident smile instantly vanished. She stared at the officer, mouth agape in disbelief. "My license is suspended. This must be a mistake," she stammered, a chill creeping into her chest. She tried to gather her thoughts, coming up with an excuse, then forced a smile, trying to explain, as if talking to a friend, but the officer's stern gaze didn't waver. "Your license has been suspended since last week," he continued, his voice unchanged, "and I need you to cooperate." Bonnie felt her forced smile fading, her expression growing increasingly anxious as it sank in that she was losing control of the situation. At that moment, she began to realize the seriousness of what she was facing. Bonnie's smile quickly disappeared, replaced by wide-eyed astonishment. "My license is suspended? That's impossible!" she exclaimed, her voice shaking, eyes wide, as if trying to find a glimmer of hope in the officer's eyes. "No way," she reassured herself, attempting to calm her racing thoughts. But not wasting another moment, she quickly came up with another excuse, trying to escape the sudden predicament. "I'm a pregnant woman. Do you understand this is an emergency situation?" Bonnie's voice suddenly rose, full of excitement, as though she were standing on stage in a presentation contest, trying to capture the officer's attention. She quickly placed a hand on her stomach, emphasizing her emergency status, hoping it would cause the officer to hesitate. Her eyes never left his, as though waiting for a sympathetic response. But the officer remained unfazed. He looked at Bonnie with a steady, cold gaze, as if reading a book where her story couldn't change a single word. "Sorry, ma'am, whether it's an emergency or not, the law is the law," he said, his tone polite but firm. Bonnie froze, her initial surprise turning into anger. It was as though the confidence she had earlier had vanished in an instant, and she felt her dignity being deeply wounded. "I didn't do anything wrong. My license can't be suspended," Bonnie shouted, nearly yelling, emphasizing each word with frustration, as if she didn't even believe it herself. She didn't care about the tone of her voice anymore. She just wanted to prove her innocence. Facing the unyielding officer, Bonnie shifted to another tactic. "Do you know how much stress a pregnant woman has to go through? And on top of that, I'm dealing with a mountain of bills and taking care of everything on my own. Do you understand that?" She tilted her head, her voice softening, trying to appear as a struggling woman who needed help. Her eyes seemed to beg for sympathy from the officer. But the officer stood motionless, his expression unchanged. He answered calmly, "We'll handle everything according to the rules, ma'am. Please cooperate." His cold eyes seemed to say that he had heard similar excuses many times before, and the law didn't allow for any leniency. Bonnie felt a wave of disappointment and anger wash over her, as if all her confidence and ability to control the situation had completely evaporated. She began to feel trapped, facing a cop who clearly had no intention of budging. By now, Bonnie could no longer maintain her confident smile. Her eyes momentarily pleaded for help, but the officer simply stared at her coldly, as though every excuse she could offer would be meaningless. The atmosphere inside the car grew thick with tension. The story became even more intense when the officer suddenly leaned in, slightly wrinkling his nose, sniffing the air inside the car. His eyes flashed with a hint of distaste. Bonnie stiffened when she noticed the change in his expression, but she quickly tried to keep calm, offering a gentle smile as if to dispel any doubt in his mind. The officer furrowed his brow, his voice low and cold. "Do you smell anything?" Bonnie blinked, pretending not to understand, but a flicker of worry appeared in her eyes. Her heart began to race as the officer mentioned the smell of marijuana in the car. She laughed nervously, trying to act natural, shrugging as if nothing was wrong. "Oh, that smell?" she said, her tone light and almost flirtatious. "That must be from before. I only use medical marijuana, for health issues, and I haven't used it in a long time." She flashed a bright smile, trying to regain her composure. But the officer didn't care for Bonnie's relaxed demeanor. He crossed his arms in front of his chest, his gaze still fixed on her, then raised an eyebrow in skepticism. "Is that so?" He tilted his head, his tone cold and somewhat mocking. "A long time ago, and yet the smell is still so strong." Bonnie froze, her smile faltering. She felt as though she'd been caught, not knowing what more to say to justify herself. Her gaze instinctively shifted to the window, scanning the surroundings as if hoping someone would appear to rescue her from this deadlock. But outside, all she saw were passing cars, distant and indifferent. She realized there was no way out, as the officer's stern gaze remained locked on her, pressing down on her like a weight. The tension escalated, and she could feel that this time no amount of excuses would save her. At this point, the officer's patience had worn thin. He bent down and sternly ordered Bonnie to step out of the car for a search. But Bonnie, in a bold and unexpected decision, gripped the steering wheel tightly, her eyes flashing with defiance and dissatisfaction. She stared straight at the officer, her voice full of indignation. "Why should I get out?" "You don't have the right to make me do that. I haven't done anything wrong." Her protest rang out on the quiet street, drawing the attention of passers-by. Some stopped to watch, with a few even quickly pulling out their phones to record the scene, as if watching a rare street performance. Bonnie felt a sense of encouragement, her eyes suddenly brightening, and she lifted her head proudly, like a heroine confronting the oppressive forces. She began to complain, in the tone of a diva who felt misunderstood, unwilling to admit any fault. To add to the drama, she raised her hand to the sky, her expression exaggerated, like a lead actress in a suspenseful movie. Her words became more and more ridiculous, but the crowd around her seemed to enjoy it more and more, creating a noisy atmosphere with giggles and chatter. Despite his patience, the officer was beginning to lose his composure. He straightened up, crossed his arms, and his gaze became as sharp as if he were trying to see through Bonnie's performance. Finally, unable to bear it any longer, he spoke firmly to bring everything to a close. "Ma'am, this is the last time I'll ask you to cooperate. If not, I will have to use force." The officer's firm and cold warning made Bonnie freeze, her confident smile fading. She looked around, her eyes scanning the curious faces that were watching her every move. No one was laughing or filming anymore. The crowd had fallen silent, waiting for what would happen next. Realizing there was no way out, Bonnie slowly let go of the steering wheel, her face showing a mix of helplessness and a slight embarrassment, as if ashamed of her earlier performance. Bonnie's resistance, which had started as a humorous act, was now coming to an end. The gazes fixed on her seemed to be waiting for what would happen next, but Bonnie could only silently endure, realizing that her overacting couldn't change the cold reality of the law. Those watching the whole situation from the beginning chuckled, some even laughed out loud, complimenting Bonnie's colorful acting. A few even whispered to their friends, "She really has talent, like she's in a movie." But to the officer, this was just a slightly more difficult task of the day. He calmly pulled out his notebook and began to list the charges. His voice was flat and slow, as if reading a shopping list. "Ma'am, you will face the following charges: driving with a suspended license, obstructing an officer, and, of course, possession of marijuana." Upon hearing this, Bonnie was stunned. Her awkward smile vanished, replaced by a look of confusion and slight disappointment. Each accusation felt like a cold wave crashing into her confidence, making her feel small and lost among the crowd that was watching. The young mother looked up at the officer, her eyes darting around, hoping to find someone in the crowd who could help her escape this bitter situation. But all she saw were curious, amused looks, waiting for the next development. From the powerful mom she had been, Bonnie was now like a student caught by the teacher for not doing her homework, too embarrassed to face the truth. She silently thought to herself, "How did I end up in this situation?" trying to console herself. But the officer didn't give Bonnie any time to reflect or regain her composure. He continued writing, his handwriting decisive and firm, as if he were all too familiar with foolish excuses and resistance. As the paperwork gradually progressed, Bonnie knew there was no way out. She glanced around once more, feeling the awkwardness filling every gaze that was locked on her. Her shoulders slowly relaxed, and she bowed her head, avoiding the eyes of the people around her. In that moment, she realized that no matter how well she performed, it couldn't cover up the truth. Bonnie's act from a humorous performance had now reached a bitter conclusion, and she was left with a feeling of helplessness as she faced the sarcastic and ironic reality of life. Bonnie's story was no longer just a street performance, but had become a vivid testament to excessive self-confidence. She had trusted herself too much, thinking that she was an untouchable queen, believing that with just a few clever words and some smooth acting, she could escape any difficult situation. She had considered herself as the one holding all the power, convinced that the noose of the officer's authority wouldn't tighten around her. But when the final cards were laid on the table, she realized that there was a clear difference between limitless self-confidence and real responsibility when sitting behind the wheel.